Now, in addition to all of these mixed race categories that you have in New Spain, you also still have full-blooded indigenous people as well. And oftentimes, many of them would live in their own Indian villages or communities or towns. Okay, and so these indigenous people also would fight back or challenge the limitations put on them by their race. Okay, because in New Spain, if you were full-blooded indigenous or full-blooded African, you were usually put at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Okay, so at the top are people who are full-blooded Spanish, right? And then in the middle you have the mixed races, and if you have more Spanish blood, you'll be higher in the social hierarchy. And then at the bottom of the social hierarchy, you have people who are full-blooded indigenous or full-blooded African. Okay, and so indigenous people who lived in their communities, they could use the judicial system to challenge the limitations put on them by Spaniards because of their race. Okay, and so we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the audiencia and how there's a court system that's set up there to protect the rights of indigenous people. And so you would have indigenous people taking Spaniards or Creoles or maybe even Peninsulares to court, right? And a lot of times it's over land issues, right? Land rights. And so they would take them to court to fight for their rights, and sometimes they would even win, right? Often, actually, many times they would win. And so sometimes the judicial system would actually work in their favor. Now, just because you win a court case doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be carried out in reality, and sometimes that was the case. But the judicial system in New Spain was there and meant to be there to protect the indigenous people, right? In some part, that was part of its purpose there. Okay, and so that's another way that indigenous people could fight back against the limitations put on them. Okay, but still, there were a lot of crimes against indigenous communities, and sometimes they would be coming from government officials. Right? We talked a little bit about this before. The corregidores or alcaldes mayores, right? These mayors or governors of a certain region, they could take advantage of indigenous communities, right? How would they take advantage of them? Maybe they could force these indigenous people to buy products, merchandise from them, and at inflated prices. Basically, they force you to buy things from them using political pressure, and they're charging an arm and a leg, right? So, they're charging really high prices. And so this is one way that they could rip off indigenous communities. Another way would be to force the indigenous communities to sell their produce to them, right? So the mayor may force the indigenous community to sell their agricultural produce to that person, to the mayor, at very cheap prices. So they could rip them off that way as well. Okay, so these are disadvantages for indigenous communities, and maybe they may take this individual to court, right? If they try to fight back, but oftentimes they could be taken advantage of by corrupt government officials who are trying to make a profit off of their political position. Okay. But indigenous communities were able to look out for each other sometimes as well, so that they wouldn't fall prey to the Spaniards. And one way that they could do this was through their fraternities, their fraternities known as cofradias. And cofradias basically are fraternities that are related to a Catholic saint. Okay, so maybe there's a particular Catholic saint that this fraternity will be dedicated to. They'll throw a feast on the feast day for that particular saint, throw other celebrations for the community. So this is like a community organization that is dedicated to the veneration of a particular Catholic saint, the cofradias. Well, these cofradias, they could actually help out their own indigenous communities, right? So these are indigenous people, right, who are part of these fraternities. And so these cofradias could actually act as a source of credit for individuals in the indigenous communities. Okay, so say you're a person from an indigenous village and you need some money, right? You're broke and you need some help. Well, if you go to a Spaniard, maybe they may take advantage of you, right? And charge like a high interest rate. Well, instead of doing that, you can go to the cofradia, right, which is basically this organization, this community organization, religious organization from your own community, and they could lend you money, right? They could lend you money. And how do they have money? Well, oftentimes they owned land. They also had livestock as well that they kept, and those are sources of income for the cofradia. So they could take that income and loan it out as credit to people within their community so that they could help their community in that way. So community members don't have to go outside the community to get loans where maybe they might get taken advantage of. Another way that indigenous communities could support each other was through the town council, which had control of the community chest, or the caja de comunidad. The caja de comunidad was basically a treasury box. It's the town treasury, right? So the town funds. Because the towns, these indigenous communities, they made money because a lot of times they owned land, and that land, that communal land, would get worked by the village, and they could sell that produce and they could make money or wealth in some form. And that was kept in a treasury box, or the caja de comunidad, and that treasury could be used to help out or support individuals within the indigenous community. Okay, so basically the cofradias and the town council with its treasury box could support indigenous communities so that they don't have to go outside of their community for support. Okay, even though they may be preyed upon by the mayor or the corregidor, they still have ways to try to protect each other and support each other financially, right, through community organizations or through the town government. And finally, we'll leave off talking about the role of Africans in Spanish colonization, because Africans took part from the very beginning, right, as soldiers who took part in the conquest of the Caribbean and of the Aztec Empire, as slaves, as well as servants. Okay, so we'll talk about the different roles that Africans played in Spanish colonization. Okay, so first as soldiers or support for soldiers. And so you have some Africans who will accompany the conquistadors on their missions, whether it be in the conquest of Cuba or the conquest of the Aztec Empire. Okay, and so there wasn't large numbers of Africans, but there were some. And so sometimes they may have the position of an unarmed auxiliary. And an auxiliary is basically someone who is offering support to the conquistadors, right? So some may be unarmed, and these individuals may be slaves. They could be somebody's personal attendant who will be there to support them and help them and carry their things. And so they could occupy that position, or they may not be enslaved, and they could just be somebody's personal servant. Okay, they could be a free person, but they could be someone's servant. And so you have these individuals who are unarmed that accompanied the conquistadors on their missions. Then you have Africans who were actually armed, right? And if they were enslaved, then they would gain their freedom because of their armed service with the Spanish conquistadors. Okay, so you have armed auxiliaries as well. And so you have Africans who played a role in the Spanish conquests of the Caribbean and in New Spain. And so the number of soldiers or auxiliaries who were Africans were fairly few. There wasn't huge numbers of Africans who were playing that particular role. The large majority were individuals who came as slaves who were brought to the Caribbean and then later to Mexico. So some slaves could act as personal servants, right? So you have personal servants who are free, but then you also have slaves who could act as personal servants as well. So you may have some slaves who are servants for their individual master, and so they may just help them out in their day-to-day affairs and do manual labor for them. But then you'll also have a large number of slaves who worked on sugar plantations, and there were a large number of sugar plantations in the Caribbean, right? That was the big profit making enterprise there in the Caribbean. But also in certain parts of New Spain as well, you find sugar plantations and even tobacco plantations. Okay, and so you have some slaves who are working on those plantations. You also have slaves who could work as miners, right? And so their slave master could rent them out as miners, or could have them working for them in mining operations, and that could make a big profit for them. Basically, they are trying to use their slaves in a way that would bring them the most income. Okay, and so mining may be that avenue to make the most profit, and so they may have their slaves work as miners. And mining was very difficult. like we talked about in Zacatecas, where there was a huge amount of silver found, right? So there was a big mining enterprise there in Zacatecas. There would be a large amount of miners. A lot of them would be slaves. At one time, it could have been a third of the labor force, the mining labor force, who were actually enslaved individuals. You also have indigenous people who worked as miners as well. And so these are various different roles that could be played by Africans in New Spain. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, just email me and I will get back to you.